Welcome to this episode of Today on Wall Street. Today we have with us Mr. James Gray, senior sports journalist at newspaper of UK. So James, as you know, on November the 2nd, Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai accused the former Chinese vice premier Zhang Gaoli of sexual assault. And her Weibo post and any mention of her name really were wiped out almost instantaneously by the Chinese state censors. James, can you please tell me a little bit about how you first heard of the Peng Shuai case? And what has the reaction been among the professional tennis or sports community and the general public in UK?
Well, I guess somewhat ironically, given the censorship that you mentioned on Chinese social media, it was social media that alerted me to it. A translation of the post into English, I don't speak Chinese, appeared on Reddit, and I read it there. And then, the kind of Twitter campaign, #WhereIsPengShui, started to kind of appear. And it obviously was extremely troubling straight off the bat because she hadn't been heard from since then. The post had clearly been removed and not by her own hand. And so I started contacting a few different people here in the West, governing bodies, the IOC, the WTA, and trying to find out if anyone had heard from her, if anyone had spoken to her, and whether anyone wanted to really confront the CCP about what was going on, because it was clear that there was some kind of censorship going on here. And then the WTA, and one of the big things I want to say today is to give the WTA enormous amounts of credit. Right. They have stood up and said, actually, we really want to know where she is and what's going on, and we're really not going to stop at anything until we do. The WTA have huge numbers of contacts. Obviously, on the women's tour, they run it. And many of them know Peng Shuai well, very well in some cases, and no one has spoken to her. So we're in a situation now where whatever you think of the kind of messages coming out from the Chinese regime, no one knows really where she is or what's going on. And that, even a couple of days ago, that was quite a worrying situation. Everything that has transpired since then makes it an extremely worrying situation, I would suggest.
I wonder if you can tell us a little more about Peng Shuai as a professional tennis player. What are some of her notable achievements?
I mean, it's difficult with these things, isn't it? Because if this happened to anybody, it should be a problem. But inevitably, people who are celebrities or sports people, because I'm a sports journalist in the end, first and foremost, end up getting more attention. Peng was until she kind of moved away from the game, beginning of 2020, she was a former world number one doubles player. She won Wimbledon with Shea here in London in 2013. She won the French Open doubles as well, and was not a bad singles player either. I think she got into the top 20, but a reasonable amount of time ago, and then kind of in her mid-20s realized that maybe doubles was where she was going to have the most success, and started playing that a bit more seriously, particularly after she came back from injury in 2014, just after she won the 2 Grand Slam titles. So she was an extremely successful doubles player. I was reading she won about $10 million in prize money, which is not to be sniffed at by anyone's approximation. So she was a very successful tennis player and obviously has a very high profile. I wouldn't say she's a household name in the UK. I think people who know their tennis know who she is, and the fact that she won Wimbledon, albeit 8 years ago, means that she's more likely to be well known. And also, the kind of reality of journalism is that sometimes you need a way to to sell who she is, and it's very easy for us to say to a UK audience, Wimbledon champion Peng Shuai. Right. I think people really connect with that because of the standing that the tournament has. So an extremely successful player, particularly in doubles, and with some, not unrespectable results in singles. So a fine player, someone who had a successful career. I think she's 35 now and was kind of winding down. And then obviously what happened. But not someone who was on the fringes of the game, someone who was at the very elite level of the game. And obviously that it's part of the reason that this case has had quite so much attention as it is.
Yes, as I was doing research on this story, I was actually very surprised to find out that tennis is now the 3rd most popular sport on TV in China and one of the fastest growing sport in the country, with lots of public and private support, actually. As a sports journalist, especially focusing on tennis, what do you think has contributed to the sport tennis's popularity in recent years in Asia, especially in China?
Well, you can't underestimate the impact Li Na had and the legacy that she has, obviously, with her success. I mean, I think I'm right. And I was doing research recently because Emma Raducanu, of course, to the complete other end, she has Chinese connections. Her mother is from northeastern China, I understand. And so she kind of has a reasonably big profile in China already. And I was doing some research when she set up a Weibo profile, and she gained a pretty, sizable number of followers in about 8 hours. I thought it was 17,000, it's reasonable for day one. And so I went to find Li Na, who has about 26 million followers on Weibo. So I think we understand the size of the celebrity she is. So yeah, I think that has definitely contributed. I also think that both the WTA and the ATP have seen China as an opportunity to grow off the back of Li Na to an extent. And the WTA have, until now, been huge supporters of tennis in China. The World Tour Finals, the end-of-year championships, the WTA's biggest event, actually, because they don't run the Grand Slams. They're kind of separate. Their biggest event was due to be held in Shenzhen this year and has been for the last couple of years. And that financially is a massive tournament. When Ash Barty won it in 2019, it was the biggest prize money any female player had ever bagged. I think it was in the region of just over $5 million. No one had ever made that money playing a tennis tournament before. And that had a huge impact around the world and made players say, hey, look, we want to go play more tournaments in China. There's already 2 top-level men's tournaments. There's a couple of women's tournaments, as well as the end-of-year finals. So, yeah, I think there's been massive investment. I mean, I don't know the regime as well, but I know that the CCP think the sport is a very useful tool for them. And so they're willing to invest in it. We've seen that from the Olympics that took place 13 years ago, the one that's going to take place in February as well, how useful they know that can be. So I think, as you mentioned, it's a combination of public and private investment. It's also a recognition of the size of the market and what other sports have done by managing to ingratiate themselves with Chinese culture to an extent and just with people on the ground, as well as the regime. The NBA have made an absolute fortune in China, one way or another. And I think, tennis is one of those sports that follows the dollar in the end. And if they think they can go and make money as well as grow a sport somewhere, those two things go hand in hand. So I would like to be less cynical about it. But I'm afraid the last couple of days have done nothing for my cynicism.
Right. As you alluded to, WTA Chairman and CEO Steve Simon has actually openly called for an investigation into Peng Shuai's sexual assault allegations that risks backlash from Beijing and even severe backlash from Beijing. So you mentioned WTA has kind of a friendly relationship with China before this, and there's also a lot of money at stake, right? And we actually know in 2019, the NBA experienced an extreme backlash and boycott in China after Houston Rockets manager Murray tweeted in support of Hong Kong's protesters. And the NBA suffered financially subsequently. So why do you think WTA decided to take a strong stance against Beijing, at least based on what we've seen so far?
Well, I mean, I don't mind saying I was surprised by it. I assumed that this was the red line. They couldn't possibly go to war effectively with the Chinese regime because, as I say, they're in for the tune of something like $14 million a year just on the WTA finals alone, and it's something like a 10-year deal. So I was very surprised. Why? I think because it's partly the nature of the allegations. This is a tour that is the women's tour. It's stands up for women all over the world. That is, in its very essence, what it does. And I think, and all credit to them, they have sat around the table and gone, you know what, these allegations are something that we can't at all stand for. And it doesn't matter who it is or what the circumstances are, they need to be investigated. And this is something we're going to draw a line and say we're not going to cross that line. I do think as well the ATP, who are currently investigating Alexander Zverev over some domestic abuse allegations that came out over the last 12 months. And they've been quite slow to act on that. They've received a lot of international criticism and I think have been threatened occasionally with more serious sanctions, other bodies kind of moving politically in the back channels. And I think the WTA probably looked at that and thought, well, we would have handled that differently. And then they were given an opportunity to handle something slightly similar differently. And they've stood up for themselves and they've stood up for women all over the world. And, yes, it might jeopardize some millions of dollars that they could make in China. But, I think the positive PR that the WTA got out of this, to take it, in a very cynical way, I think everyone has said, wow, the women's tennis store really stands for something. And it's so refreshing to be sitting here talking to you and to be talking about a big sporting body making a statement against these things rather than, for example, what we've seen from the IOC, which has frankly been very weak.
Right. I mean, compared with the IOC statement, the WTA statement really is on point. It is strong. It's firm.
It's enormously strong. Yeah.
Yes. But speaking of China's response, yesterday, China's state-owned television broadcaster CGTN released an email purportedly from Peng Shuai herself, claiming that she was safe. There was nothing to worry about. But Steve Simon has since cast doubt on the email, saying it only raises further concerns for Peng Shuai's safety. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the CGTN email. Is it problematic? What do you think is problematic or suspicious about the email?
Yeah, it's one of the more remarkable things. I saw a journalist who covers China quite regularly tweet something like that. This ham-fistedness is kind of part and parcel of the way the CCP try to control people, because when you are so dominant as they are in China, you don't have to worry about being convincing. And yeah, I think as soon as I saw it, well, this clearly isn't true. This clearly isn't a genuine email. A few people spotted a sort of cursor in the middle of it, which they said was a smoking gun. I don't think it is. Steve Simon has said that he did receive an email, but that he has no confidence that it is from Peng Shuai genuinely. And I'm completely with him on that. I don't know Shuai personally, but it doesn't read normally. It doesn't read like a thing a normal person would say, never mind, Peng Shuai herself. So, yeah, it's extremely troubling to read that, because it goes beyond what we thought or hoped might be a miscommunication, or that maybe she just kind of wanted to run away from everything and not deal with it for a couple of weeks. It suggests that there is foul play. It suggests that someone is, writing an email that looks like it's from her because they're not allowing her to speak for herself. And that is very troubling. I've spoken to a couple of human rights groups over the last couple of days who tell me that this is not unusual, that this is generally part of the plan. When the CCP want to deal with someone who is dissenting against the regime, that this is how they will operate. They will cut them off entirely, generally put them under house arrest or something similar, take them off the grid. And then if the world starts to demand to hear from them, they will try and make the world hear from them in whatever underhand and as a colleague of mine described, ham-fisted way that they can. I desperately hope she's safe and fine and that email is from her, but I have absolutely zero confidence that it is.
What do you expect will happen next? Will China back down amid growing international concern for Peng Shuai's whereabouts? Will WTA pull out of China, as Simon seemed to suggest?
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because to a certain extent, we're in kind of uncharted territory here. So few people seem to stand up to the CCP in the way that the WTA have. And I say the CCP because I don't want to sit here and say China is a bad place. It's not. This is definitely a case of the Chinese regime and not the Chinese people. It's important to stress that, because the Chinese people are ultimately the people who are going to suffer here, probably. I think that the idea of WTA holding tournaments in China next year is frankly laughable. Not because they don't want to, not because the Chinese regime don't want them to, but because particularly the second message, which pretty much is an ultimatum from Steve Simon, it's in PR terms, in publicity terms, it's pretty close to a declaration of war. And I think that there isn't much coming back from that. If you mentioned the NBA earlier, my understanding of that is it was pretty instantaneous and pretty hardcore blackout of basketball for the best part of a year in China. And we're already seeing pretty heavy censorship on social media like Weibo of even the word tennis. Users struggling to make sort of quite mundane posts about tennis because the censors are working so hard to shut down any discussion of it in any way. The WTA still has an active Weibo profile, but they are struggling to use it properly. It's being pretty heavily censored. Naomi Osaka, of course, who spoke out a couple of days ago, people were posting on one of her Weibo posts underneath it saying thank you. And the authorities just disabled comments on that post because they didn't want people drawing attention to what she had said on Twitter and Instagram. So I think you're going to see a pretty severe cyber war in that sense. It's something the CCP are very good at. It's something they're very well versed in. They do a hell of a lot of resource to. I would be surprised to see the full planned schedule of Chinese events on WTA Tour next year. As for the fate of Peng Shuai and the kind of the investigation into the allegations, who knows? It's anyone's guess. I hope that the level of reaction and the fact that we're talking about this now, the fact that lots of high-profile players have been talking about it and hopefully will continue to talk about it, I hope that will mean that if she's being held or detained unlawfully, that she will be released, because I think the Chinese regime may see that it's not worth kind of the fight. We've seen it in previous circumstances with, it's not as severe as that, but someone like Ai Weiwei, it was kind of as a result of a large Western kind of campaign to get him more freedom, and eventually, obviously, left the country. And similarly with Liu Jia, who was under house arrest for the best part of a decade, it was only because of this kind of global campaign that she was able to get her freedom back. Mm-hmm. So I hope that by continuing to talk about it, by continuing to tweet about it, and continuing to do everything we can, that it'll be resolved and no one gets hurt, and the principles of freedom of speech and freedom of expression and crucially freedom to be a woman, which is really what this is about. This is about a serious potentially crime against a woman, that is specifically a crime committed against women all over the world, is investigated and stamped out. Because I think from what I've read, and you may know better than me, Lizzie, but the Me Too movement in China has not hit at the heart of government as hard as this has the potential to do, and that it could have a real impact on kind of women's rights in the country, I hope.
Right. Well, thank you so much, James. This is such a wonderful conversation. We'll make sure to include your Twitter handle in our show notes section, so our audience can follow you and know more about what's going on there and follow the recent updates on Peng Shuai's case. Thank you so much, James. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks very much, Lizzie. I hope that was helpful. Thank you so much for your time.
Very helpful. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
感谢您来到由我李琦 Lizzi 为您带来的今日华尔街频道。在看过节目之后，如果喜欢，请别忘了为节目点赞，也请您在留言区留下您对节目的见解和意见。如果您是频道会员的话，我们会在第一时间回复您的留言，解答您的疑问。另外，如果还没有订阅的话，请记得要订阅频道，并且打开订阅按钮旁边的小铃铛，这样您就可以在第一时间收到节目发布的最新信息了。再次感谢您观看今日华尔街频道，我是李琦，我们下次再会。